The candles had barely been lit when Alina Whitmore felt the first cold drop of dread slide down her spine. She sat at the head of the long dinner table inside Cranley Manor, her back straight, her hands folded, her face arranged into the calm smile a duchess was trained to wear no matter what happened around her. But something was wrong tonight. She could feel it in the air before a single word was spoken. Her husband, Duke Reginald Ashford, sat across the table, laughing louder than she had heard him laugh in months. Not at her. Not because of anything she had said. He was laughing at something Lady Camilla Hartley had just whispered to him, leaning close, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the table near his. Alina watched the candlelight flicker across her husband's face and noticed the way his eyes lingered on Camilla a heartbeat too long. It was such a small thing. Anyone else at the table might have missed it entirely. But Alina had spent 11 years learning every expression that crossed her husband's face, every shift in his voice, every subtle change in the way he held himself. And what she saw now was a man completely absorbed in another woman, in front of 30 guests, in his own home, at his own table, while his wife sat only a few feet away. "You have the sharpest wit I have encountered in London this entire season," Reginald said to Camilla, raising his glass slightly toward her. "It is rare to find a woman who speaks her mind so freely and so well." The table murmured with polite amusement. Someone chuckled. A fork clinked softly against porcelain. Alina kept her smile fixed, though her fingers tightened beneath the table where no one could see them. She had heard compliments before. A duke was expected to be charming, gracious, generous with his words at social gatherings. She had never minded when he praised another woman's gown or her singing voice or her skill at cards. Those were small courtesies, the kind that meant nothing beyond good manners, but this was different. This felt deliberate. This felt aimed. Camilla lowered her lashes and smiled in a way that seemed rehearsed, as though she had practiced exactly how much modesty to show while still inviting more attention. "You flatter me too much, Your Grace," she said softly, though her eyes said she wanted exactly the opposite of what her words claimed. Reginald leaned back in his chair, clearly pleased with himself, clearly enjoying being watched by the entire table as he continued the conversation. "Not at all. I find honesty refreshing. So many people in this room only tell me what they think I wish to hear." His gaze flicked briefly around the table, as if making a quiet accusation before returning to Camilla. "You are not one of them." Alina felt her stomach tighten. She glanced down the table at her closest friend, Margaret Aldridge, who sat halfway between them. Margaret's eyes met hers for only a moment, but in that moment Alina saw something she rarely saw on Margaret's face: pity. That was the moment it became real. Not when Reginald spoke the words, but when Alina saw pity reflected back at her from someone who loved her. She realized then that everyone at this table had noticed. Every guest, every servant standing quietly against the walls, every person holding a fork or a glass had watched their duke lavish attention on a woman who was not his wife, in the very dining room where his wife had hosted 100 dinners exactly like this one. She thought of all the meals she had planned herself, choosing each dish with care, instructing the kitchen staff on timing and presentation, making certain the flowers matched the season, and the wine complemented the courses. She thought of the hours she had spent ensuring every detail of Cranley Manor ran smoothly, not because anyone demanded it of her, but because she had once believed this was her home, her family, her life to protect and nurture. And now she sat within that same home, watching her husband treat another woman as though she were the one who belonged at the head of his table. "Duchess Ashford," came a voice from her left. It was Lord Pemberton, an older gentleman who had known the family for decades, attempting to draw her back into the conversation. "You have been quiet this evening. Is the fish not to your liking?" Alina turned to him, grateful for the distraction, and offered the practiced smile she had perfected over years of public appearances. "The fish is lovely, my lord. I confess I was simply enjoying the conversation." It was, of course, a lie. But lies came easily to a woman who had spent over a decade learning to hide her true feelings behind pleasant words. She had learned that lesson early in her marriage, learned it the way one learns to walk on a floor that occasionally gives way beneath careless feet. As the dinner continued, Alina found herself watching the scene unfold as though from a great distance, as though she were no longer truly present at her own table, but instead observing a play performed for her benefit, a cruel comedy where everyone knew the lines except her. Reginald continued to speak with Camilla throughout the remainder of the meal, occasionally drawing others into the conversation but always circling back to her, always finding reasons to compliment something about her. Her intelligence, her taste in literature, the color of the gown she wore that evening, a deep emerald that Alina privately thought clashed terribly with the woman's complexion, though she said nothing of it. By the time dessert arrived, a delicate lemon tart that Alina had specifically requested from the kitchen because it was Reginald's favorite, she found she had lost her appetite entirely. She pushed the small plate aside and folded her hands in her lap, watching her husband laugh once more at something Camilla had said. She thought about the early years of their marriage, when Reginald had looked at her the way he now looked at Camilla, with genuine interest, with warmth, with something that had once resembled love. She remembered how he used to seek her opinion on matters of the estate, how he used to bring her small gifts from his travels, how he used to whisper to her alone after guests had departed, sharing his true thoughts about the evening rather than performing for an audience. When had that changed? She could not point to a single moment. It had happened slowly, the way a house grows cold in winter, 1 degree at a time, until one day you realize you have been shivering for months without noticing exactly when the warmth left. The dinner finally drew to a close. Guests began to rise from their seats, exchanging pleasantries, thanking their hosts for a wonderful evening. Alina stood as well, moving through the familiar motions of a hostess bidding farewell to her guests, though her mind felt distant, as though she were watching her own hands shake hands and her own voice thank people for coming. Camilla approached her near the end, offering a curtsy that seemed just slightly too shallow for proper respect. "Thank you for a delightful evening, Duchess. Your table was, as always, exquisite." Alina studied the younger woman's face for a moment, searching for any sign of guilt or awareness of what had transpired that evening. She found none. Camilla's expression remained perfectly composed, perhaps even faintly triumphant, as though she had won some contest Alina had not known she was competing in. "I am glad you enjoyed it," Alina replied, her voice steady despite everything churning beneath the surface. "Safe travels home, Lady Hartley." As the last of the carriages pulled away from the front of Cranley Manor, Alina stood in the entrance hall, listening to the fading sound of horses' hooves against the gravel drive. The great house had grown quiet around her, the servants already beginning to clear the dining room, the candles slowly being extinguished one by one throughout the halls. Reginald appeared beside her, still smiling faintly from the evening's entertainment, seemingly oblivious to the storm building behind his wife's calm expression. "That went rather well, did it not?" Lord Pemberton seemed most pleased with the arrangements. Alina turned to look at him, this man she had married so many years ago, this man whose face she had once studied with such devotion that she could have drawn it from memory in perfect detail. Now she studied it again, but this time searching for something else entirely. She searched for remorse, for awareness, for any indication that he understood what he had done that evening. She found nothing but easy contentment, the expression of a man who believed the world was exactly as pleasant as he wished it to be. "Yes," she said quietly, "it went very well indeed." She did not raise her voice. She did not accuse him of anything. She simply turned and walked toward the staircase, her steps measured and calm, though inside her something had shifted so completely that she knew, with absolute certainty, that she would never again sit at that table and watch him look at another woman the way he had looked at Camilla Hartley that night. She climbed the stairs slowly, one hand trailing along the polished wooden banister that generations of Ashford Duchesses had touched before her. She passed the portraits lining the staircase wall, women in elegant gowns, women who had once stood exactly where she stood now, women whose names she knew from family records but whose true stories she would never know. Had they felt this way too? Had they stood in their own halls, watching their husbands admire other women, and simply accepted it as the price of their position? She reached the top of the stairs and turned down the corridor toward her private chambers, away from the room she shared with Reginald on nights when he chose to visit her, which had become increasingly rare in recent months. She had not thought much of it before tonight, had told herself he was simply busy, simply tired, simply consumed with matters of the estate. Now she understood differently. Now she understood that something inside their marriage had quietly died long before tonight's dinner, and tonight had simply been the moment she finally allowed herself to see it clearly. She entered her chambers and closed the door softly behind her, leaning back against it in the darkness, listening to the sound of her own breathing. Downstairs, she could hear Reginald's voice, still cheerful, giving instructions to a servant about something inconsequential, as though the evening had been entirely ordinary, as though nothing significant had occurred at all. For him, perhaps nothing had. But for Alina, standing alone in the darkness of a room that had once felt like a sanctuary and now felt like a cage, something significant had indeed occurred. A decision had begun forming in her mind, quiet and certain, the way winter frost forms slowly across a window pane, until suddenly the entire surface is covered in patterns too intricate and too complete to have happened all at once. She did not sleep that night. She lay awake staring at the canopy above her bed, replaying every word Reginald had spoken to Camilla, every glance, every laugh. She thought of the years she had given to this marriage, the years she had spent managing this household, hosting these dinners, representing this family in society, all while slowly disappearing into the role of Duchess, until she sometimes forgot what her own voice sounded like when she was not performing for an audience. Somewhere in the depths of that long, sleepless night, Alina Whitmore Ashford made a promise to herself. She would not confront him with tears or anger, though both burned within her. She would not make a scene or demand an apology he likely would not understand he needed to give. Instead, she would wait, watch, and think carefully about what she truly wanted her life to become. Because for the first time in 11 years of marriage, Alina understood with perfect clarity that she had a choice. She had always had a choice, though she had forgotten it somewhere along the way, buried beneath duty and expectation, and the comfortable weight of a title that had never truly fit the woman wearing it. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep through the curtains of her window, Alina finally closed her eyes, not from peace, but from exhaustion. And in that final moment before sleep finally claimed her, she thought of the small ring of household keys that sat locked in her writing desk, symbols of everything she had built and managed and protected within these walls for over a decade. She wondered, for the very first time in her marriage, what it might feel like to set them down. The morning arrived too quickly, sunlight spilling harsh and unwelcome across Alina's face, as she finally woke from the few restless hours of sleep she had managed to steal before dawn. For a moment, lying there in the tangled sheets, she almost convinced herself that the previous evening had been nothing more than an unpleasant dream, the kind that fades quickly once the eyes open and the mind returns to ordinary concerns. But then she remembered Camilla's face, the emerald gown, the sound of Reginald's laughter, and she knew with sinking certainty that nothing about last night had been imagined. It had all been painfully, undeniably real. She rose from her bed and moved to the window, pulling back the heavy curtains to look out over the grounds of Cranley Manor. The garden stretched below her in perfect symmetry, hedges trimmed with precision, flower beds arranged in colors that changed with each season according to her own careful instructions. She had designed much of this garden herself, had spent countless hours discussing plans with the head gardener, choosing which roses would climb which walls, which paths would wind through which groves of trees. It was beautiful. It was also, she realized as she stood there, entirely someone else's beauty now, something she had created and tended but that had never truly belonged to her, not in the way that mattered. The land belonged to the Ashford family, entailed to pass through generations of men, and she was simply the current caretaker, valued for her ability to maintain what others had built and would inherit. A soft knock came at her door. Her lady's maid, a gentle young woman named Charlotte who had served Alina faithfully for nearly 5 years, entered with her usual quiet efficiency, carrying a tray with tea and toast. "Good morning, Your Grace," Charlotte said, setting the tray down carefully on the small table near the window. "I trust you slept well." Elinor turned from the window and offered a faint smile, though she suspected it did not quite reach her eyes. "Well enough, thank you, Charlotte." Charlotte hesitated for a moment, her hands twisting slightly in the fabric of her apron before speaking again. "Your Grace, if I may say something, last night at dinner, several of the staff noticed. We only wish you to know that whatever happens, we remain loyal to you." Elinor felt something tighten in her throat at the young woman's unexpected kindness. It was rare for servants to speak so directly about matters concerning their employers, and rarer still for them to offer such open sympathy. She realized then that the entire household had witnessed her humiliation, had discussed it amongst themselves, had perhaps pitied her in the kitchens and hallways while she slept. "Thank you, Charlotte," Elinor said softly. "That means more to me than you know." After Charlotte departed, Elinor sat alone with her tea, staring out at the gardens without truly seeing them. Her mind kept returning to the same question, circling it again and again like a bird unable to find a place to land. What would she do now? What could she do? She thought of her position, her responsibilities, the expectations placed upon a woman of her standing. Society did not look kindly upon duchesses who abandoned their husbands, regardless of the reasons. There would be scandal, whispered conversations behind fans at every ball she might attend for years to come, questions about her character rather than her husband's behavior. The world, she knew all too well, rarely judged men and women by the same standard. But then she thought of something else entirely. She thought of her aunt, her mother's sister, a woman named Beatrice who had never married, who had lived independently on a modest but comfortable estate inherited from their grandfather, who had spent her life traveling, reading, painting, answering to no one but herself. Elinor had visited Aunt Beatrice only a handful of times throughout her childhood, but she remembered vividly the sense of freedom that seemed to surround the older woman, the way she spoke her mind without fear, the way her laughter came easily and often, unlike the careful, measured amusement Elinor had learned to perform in Reginald's presence. Aunt Beatrice had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving her modest estate, a property called Thornfield Cottage, to Elinor in her will. Elinor had visited the property only once since inheriting it, finding it charming but small, nothing compared to the grandeur of Cranley Manor. She had left a caretaker in charge and had not thought much about the cottage since, too consumed with her duties as Duchess to consider what it might mean to actually live there herself. Now, sitting in her chambers with cold tea forgotten beside her, Elinor found her thoughts returning again and again to Thornfield Cottage, to the small room she remembered, the overgrown but charming garden, the quiet countryside setting far from London society and its endless judgments. Could she truly leave? Could she truly walk away from everything she had built here, from her title, her position, the only life she had known as an adult woman? The thought terrified her even as it also, quietly and persistently, began to feel like something closer to hope than fear. She spent the following days in careful observation, watching Reginald more closely than she had in years. She noticed how frequently Camilla's name arose in his conversations, how he found excuses to attend gatherings where he knew she would be present, how his letters, which he sometimes left carelessly upon his desk, contained references to correspondence with the younger woman. She noticed, too, how little attention he paid to Elinor herself during this time. He did not ask about her day, did not inquire after her thoughts on estate matters as he once had, did not seek her company in the evenings beyond what was required for appearances. She had become, she realized with painful clarity, little more than a fixture in his household, present but unseen, valued for her role rather than her presence. One evening, nearly a week after the fateful dinner, Elinor found herself in the estate's small library, searching through old family records and legal documents that she had inherited alongside the property from her aunt. She wanted to understand precisely what she owned, what freedoms and resources existed beyond her identity as Duchess of Cranley. She discovered that Thornfield Cottage came with a small but steady income from its surrounding farmland, enough to support a modest but comfortable independent life. She discovered that her aunt had also left her a sum of money, kept separate from the Ashford family finances, held in trust and untouched since her aunt's passing. She had known of this inheritance vaguely, but had never given it serious consideration, never imagined she might actually need it for the purpose now forming clearly in her mind. As she sat there in the dim candlelight of the library, papers spread across the desk before her, Alina felt something she had not felt in a very long time. She felt the stirrings of possibility, the recognition that her life did not have to remain confined within the walls of Cranley Manor, bound to a husband who no longer truly saw her, performing a role that had slowly consumed every part of herself that once felt genuine and alive. She closed the ledger books carefully and sat back in her chair, staring at the flickering candle flame before her. The decision was not yet made, not fully, not completely. But the seed of it had been planted, and Alina knew from long experience with her own garden that once a seed took root, it rarely remained buried for long. Outside her window, the night had grown fully dark, stars scattered across the sky above Cranley Manor, indifferent to the quiet transformation taking place within the woman who sat alone in the library, contemplating a future entirely different from the one she had believed, only a week earlier, was the only life available to her. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Reginald's footsteps, his voice calling for a servant, the ordinary sounds of a life continuing as though nothing had changed. But for Alina, everything had changed. She simply had not yet decided what she would do about it. Not yet, but soon. Margaret Aldridge arrived at Cranley Manor 3 days later, unannounced, her carriage rattling up the long gravel drive just as the afternoon sun began to soften into gold. Alina watched from her sitting room window as her closest friend stepped down from the carriage, adjusting her bonnet with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had made up her mind about something, and intended to act on it before losing her nerve. By the time Margaret reached the sitting room, Alina had already rung for tea, though neither woman touched the cups once they were poured. Margaret sat across from her, folding her gloved hands in her lap, studying Alina's face with the careful attention of someone searching for cracks beneath a carefully maintained surface. "I could not stop thinking of you," Margaret said finally, "not since that dinner. I have half a mind to write a strongly worded letter to your husband myself, though I doubt he would understand a single word of criticism directed at him." Despite everything, Alina found herself smiling, the first genuine smile that had touched her lips in days. "You always did have more courage than sense, Margaret." "Someone in this family needs it," Margaret replied, though her tone had softened. She leaned forward slightly. "Alina, tell me honestly, how are you, truly?" Alina considered the question for a long moment, turning her teacup slowly in its saucer without drinking from it. She thought about lying, about offering the same practiced reassurances she gave to everyone else, the same performance she had perfected over 11 years of marriage. But this was Margaret, who had known her since they were girls together in the schoolroom, who had stood beside her on her wedding day, who had never once judged her for anything Alina had confided in the years since. "I do not know how to answer that," Alina admitted quietly. "I have spent so many years thinking of myself as Reginald's wife, as the Duchess of Cranley, that I am not entirely certain who I am when I strip away those titles. But I know this. I cannot continue sitting at that table, watching him look at other women the way he used to look at me. I cannot continue pretending that everything is well when everything is very far from well." Margaret nodded slowly, her expression grave. "Have you spoken with him?" "Truly spoken, not the polite conversations you have perfected for public occasions." "Not yet," Alina said. "I have been gathering my thoughts, trying to understand what I actually want before I say anything to him that cannot be unsaid." "And what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them, simple in its wording but enormous in its implications. Alina set down her teacup and looked directly at her friend, feeling something steady settle within her chest for the first time in days. "I want to know if there is anything left to save," she said, "and if there is not, I want the courage to walk away from it." Margaret reached across the small distance between their chairs and took Alina's hand, squeezing it firmly. Whatever you decide, you will not be alone. I promise you that. That evening, after Margaret had departed and the house had grown quiet, Alina made her way to Reginald's study, a room she rarely entered uninvited. She found him seated behind his large mahogany desk, a glass of brandy at his elbow, a stack of correspondence spread before him. He glanced up as she entered, his expression shifting briefly into surprise before settling into mild curiosity. Alina, this is unexpected. Is something the matter? She closed the door behind her and stood for a moment, gathering her composure, before crossing the room to sit in the chair opposite his desk, the same chair where estate managers and solicitors sat when discussing business matters, never the chair of an intimate conversation between husband and wife. I wish to speak with you about the dinner last week, she said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. Reginald set down his pen, his brow furrowing slightly, though whether from concern or irritation, Alina could not immediately tell. What about it? I thought it went rather well. For you, perhaps, Alina said. For me, it was one of the most difficult evenings I have endured in this marriage. Reginald leaned back in his chair, studying her with an expression that seemed genuinely puzzled. Whatever do you mean? What occurred that could possibly have troubled you so deeply? Alina felt a flash of something close to disbelief. Did he truly not understand? Had he been so consumed by his own enjoyment of the evening that he had failed entirely to notice the effect it had on his own wife? You spent the entire evening praising Lady Hartley, she said, keeping her voice level though every word felt like it cost her something to speak aloud. Her wit, her honesty, her gown. You barely spoke 2 words to me throughout the meal, and yet you found endless compliments for a woman who is not your wife, at my table, in front of 30 guests. Understanding began to dawn slowly across Reginald's face, though it was mixed. Alina noted with growing dismay, with something closer to defensiveness than genuine remorse. Alina, you cannot possibly be jealous of a bit of pleasant conversation. Camilla is an amusing young woman, nothing more. Surely you do not think there is anything improper occurring. That is not the point, Alina said, her frustration beginning to seep through her carefully maintained calm. The point is that you humiliated me. Whether or not your intentions were improper, the effect was the same. Every person at that table saw a duke enamored with another woman while his own wife sat forgotten beside him. Reginald ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Alina recognized as one he made when he felt cornered by an argument he did not wish to have. You are exaggerating the matter considerably. I was simply being sociable. It is my duty as host to ensure all guests feel welcomed and valued. And do I not deserve to feel valued in my own home? Alina asked, her voice rising slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. When was the last time you complimented me in front of guests, Reginald? When was the last time you sought my opinion, my company, my thoughts on anything beyond the management of this household? Reginald fell silent for a long moment, and for one hopeful instant, Alina believed he might finally understand, might finally see the distance that had grown between them over the past several years. But when he spoke again, his tone had turned defensive rather than reflective. I do not understand why you are making such a matter of this. We have been married 11 years, Alina. Marriages settle into comfortable patterns. That is simply the nature of things. I fail to see why a bit of harmless conversation with Camilla Hartley should be cause for such distress. Something cold and clear settled over Alina in that moment, a realization more painful than any anger could have been. He truly did not understand. He truly believed that her feelings, her sense of dignity, her need to be seen and valued within her own marriage, were matters of excessive sensitivity rather than legitimate concerns deserving of his attention. I see, Alina said quietly, rising from her chair. Thank you for your honesty, Reginald. Alina, wait. He rose as well, though he made no move to close the distance between them. I did not mean to upset you. If it troubles you so greatly, I shall be more careful in the future about my conversations at dinner. But Alina was already walking toward the door, and his words, meant as a concession, felt instead like confirmation of everything she had feared. He would be more careful. He would manage his behavior to avoid future confrontations. But he had offered no genuine understanding of why his actions had wounded her, no acknowledgement of the years of quiet neglect that had led to this moment, no true remorse beyond a desire to avoid further unpleasant conversations. She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle, and turned back to look at him one final time. "That is not what I wanted to hear, Reginald. But I thank you for showing me clearly where I stand." She left the study before he could respond, walking quickly through the corridors of Cranley Manor until she reached the privacy of her own chambers, where she finally allowed the tears she had been holding back to fall freely. She wept not from heartbreak alone, though heartbreak was certainly part of it, but from the painful clarity of finally understanding, after 11 years of marriage, that she had been fighting for the attention and respect of a man who did not comprehend why either mattered. The following weeks passed in a strange, suspended quality, as though Alina were moving through her days underwater, every action deliberate and slow, every thought weighted with the decision she knew was forming but had not yet allowed herself to fully embrace. She continued her duties as Duchess, managing the household, corresponding with tenants and tradesmen, attending the social engagements expected of her position. But beneath the surface of this continued performance, something fundamental had shifted. She began, quietly and without announcement, to review every document related to her inheritance from Aunt Beatrice. She wrote to the solicitor who managed the trust, inquiring about the exact terms of the inheritance, the income generated by Thornfield Cottage and its surrounding land, the process required should she wish to take up residence there herself. The solicitor, a discreet older gentleman named Mr. Farnsworth, who had served her aunt faithfully for decades, responded promptly and thoroughly, providing all the information she requested without asking why a duchess would suddenly take such interest in a modest countryside cottage. She also began, carefully and methodically, to set aside certain personal items, small treasures that held sentimental value beyond their material worth. A collection of letters from her late mother, a small portrait of her aunt that had hung in the library for years, books she had loved since childhood, gifts from friends over the years, items that felt distinctly her own rather than belonging to the Ashford family legacy. She did all of this quietly, without drawing attention, telling herself she was simply organizing her belongings, simply ensuring she understood her own finances and property. She did not yet allow herself to consciously acknowledge that she was preparing for a departure she had not yet fully decided to make. Reginald, for his part, seemed to notice nothing amiss in his wife's behavior. He continued his pattern of social engagements, his correspondence with various acquaintances that Alina now watched more carefully than before, though she found no evidence of impropriety beyond what she had already witnessed at the fateful dinner. Perhaps, she considered, there was nothing truly improper occurring between Reginald and Camilla Hartley. Perhaps his interest was exactly as innocent as he claimed, a simple appreciation for pleasant conversation with an amusing young woman. But that realization, rather than comforting her, only deepened her understanding of the true problem within her marriage. It was not infidelity that had broken something essential between them. It was neglect. It was the slow, cumulative weight of years spent unseen, unheard, valued only for her ability to manage a household and maintain appearances rather than cherished as a woman with her own thoughts, her own dreams, her own need for genuine connection and respect. One evening, nearly a month after the dinner that had changed everything, Alina found herself in the garden as twilight settled over Cranley Manor, walking slowly along the paths she had designed years earlier, running her fingers gently over the roses she had chosen for their particular shade of deep crimson. She thought of all the years she had poured into this place, this marriage, this identity as Duchess of Cranley, and she felt, for the first time, a strange and unexpected sense of grief, not for what she was about to lose, but for all the years she had already lost without fully realizing it. She sat down on a small stone bench near the center of the garden, the same bench where she had once sat with Reginald during their courtship, listening to him speak of his hopes for their future together. hopes that had once included her as an equal partner in his life rather than a fixture within his household. She wondered what had happened to that young man, that hopeful vision of partnership they had once shared. Perhaps it had simply faded, as many things do, worn away by the daily pressures of managing an estate, maintaining a title, fulfilling social obligations that left little room for genuine intimacy. Or perhaps she considered with painful honesty that vision had never been as real as she once believed. Perhaps she had simply wanted it badly enough to imagine it into existence, seeing what she hoped for rather than what truly existed between them. As darkness fully descended over the garden, Alina rose from the bench and made her way back toward the house, her decision, though still unspoken even to herself, growing clearer with each step. She was not yet ready to act. But she was, for the first time in many years, ready to acknowledge the truth of her situation rather than continuing to perform contentment she no longer genuinely felt. Inside the house, she found a letter waiting for her on her writing desk, delivered earlier that day, but only now noticed amid her distracted state. It was from Mr. Farnsworth, confirming that Thornfield Cottage remained in excellent condition, well maintained by the caretaker she had employed, and entirely ready to receive its owner should she wish to visit or take up residence at any time. Alina read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in the drawer of her desk alongside the household keys that had sat there, unused for their intended purpose, since the night of the dinner. She had not yet decided when she would leave, or precisely how she would manage the practical details of such a significant change. But she understood now, with a clarity that felt both terrifying and liberating, that she would indeed leave. It was no longer a question of if, but simply of when, and how she might do so with the dignity and grace that had defined her throughout her marriage, even as that marriage had slowly failed to offer her the same consideration in return. Winter arrived early that year, bringing with it a chill that seemed to seep into every corner of Cranley Manor, though Alina suspected the cold she felt most acutely had little to do with the weather outside. She continued her quiet preparations throughout the following weeks, growing more decisive with each passing day, though she confided her plans to no one beyond Margaret, who visited frequently and offered steady, unwavering support without ever pressuring Alina to move faster than she felt ready. "You must be certain," Margaret told her during one such visit, as the two women sat together in Alina's sitting room, a fire crackling warmly in the hearth. "Once you take this step, there will be no easy path back. Society will speak of little else for months. Some will call you foolish, others will call you brave, and most will simply enjoy the scandal without genuine concern for your well-being either way." "I am aware of what awaits me," Alina replied, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "I have thought of little else these past weeks, but I have also thought carefully about what awaits me should I remain, and I find that prospect far more frightening than any scandal society might produce." Margaret studied her friend's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then I will support you in whatever you decide, and however you choose to proceed." It was during this same period that Alina began to notice a curious change occurring within herself, subtle at first but growing steadily more pronounced. As she allowed herself to genuinely accept that she would leave her marriage, she found herself feeling lighter, more present in her daily activities, more capable of finding small moments of genuine pleasure rather than merely performing contentment for the benefit of others. She began reading again, truly reading, losing herself in novels and poetry the way she had as a young woman before marriage and duty had consumed most of her time and attention. She began sketching once more, a hobby she had abandoned years earlier, filling small notebooks with drawings of the garden, of birds she observed from her window, of scenes from her memory that she wished to preserve. She also began, quietly and carefully, to have more honest conversations with the household staff, who had served her faithfully throughout her marriage. She spoke with the housekeeper about the proper management of accounts and inventories, ensuring that whoever eventually took on the role of managing Cranley Manor's daily operations would find clear, well-organized records. She spoke with the head gardener about the specific care required for the roses she had planted years earlier, wanting to ensure they would continue to flourish even after she departed. These conversations felt, to Alina, like a form of quiet farewell, though she had not yet announced her intentions openly to anyone beyond Margaret. She was, in her own methodical way, preparing not just herself, but everyone and everything connected to her role as Duchess for the transition that was coming, even if the timing of that transition remained uncertain even to herself. Reginald, throughout this period, remained largely oblivious to the transformation occurring within his wife. He continued his social engagements, his correspondence, his evenings spent away from home more frequently than had once been his habit. When he did spend time with Alina, their conversations remained polite but distant, touching on practical matters of the household or upcoming social obligations rather than anything approaching genuine intimacy. Alina found, somewhat to her surprise, that she felt less pain with each passing week regarding this distance between them. Where once his absence and inattention had wounded her deeply, she now observed these same patterns with a strange sense of detachment, as though she were already beginning to view her marriage from the outside, as a chapter of her life drawing toward its natural conclusion rather than an ongoing source of daily hope and disappointment. One particularly cold evening in late winter, as snow fell softly outside the windows of Cranley Manor, Alina sat alone in the library, reviewing the final details of her plans with the careful attention she had once devoted to organizing dinner parties and social events. She had decided, after much consideration, that she would depart in early spring, once the roads had cleared sufficiently for comfortable travel, and once she had completed the final arrangements necessary to ensure a smooth transition for the household staff who depended upon Cranley Manor for their livelihoods. She had written to Mr. Farnsworth again, requesting that Thornfield Cottage be fully prepared to receive her, that additional staff be hired if necessary to ensure the property could comfortably accommodate her needs. She had begun quietly packing certain personal belongings, storing them carefully in trunks that she kept in a rarely used storage room, away from the notice of servants who might mention such preparations to Reginald before she was ready for him to know. She had also begun drafting, though not yet finalizing, the words she would eventually need to speak or write to explain her departure, both to Reginald and to the wider society that would inevitably demand some explanation for the disappearance of a duchess from her rightful place within her husband's household. As she sat there in the quiet library, candlelight flickering across the pages of her notebook, Alina felt a profound sense of calm settle over her, different from the numbness that had characterized the weeks immediately following the fateful dinner. This calm felt earned, the product of careful thought and genuine acceptance rather than mere resignation. She was not fleeing her marriage in a moment of impulsive anger or heartbreak. She was choosing, deliberately and with full awareness of the consequences, to build a different life for herself, one where she would no longer need to perform contentment she did not feel, no longer need to compete for attention and respect that should have been freely given. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the garden she had so carefully tended over the years, softening the edges of the world into something quiet and still. Alina closed her notebook and rose from her chair, moving to stand before the window, watching the snowflakes drift down through the darkness illuminated by the faint glow of candlelight from the house. Spring would arrive eventually, as it always did, bringing with it the thaw that would clear the roads and allow her finally to make the journey toward the new life she had begun building in her mind and in her careful, methodical preparations. Until then, she would continue as she had these past weeks, maintaining the appearance of her role as Duchess while quietly, steadily, preparing to set that role aside entirely. She thought again of the household keys resting in her writing desk drawer, waiting for the moment when she would finally place them where Reginald would find them. A silent message requiring no further words, no lengthy explanation beyond what the gesture itself would convey. Those keys represented everything she had built and maintained within this marriage, every responsibility she had shouldered, every duty she had fulfilled with dedication and care. Setting them down would mean releasing all of that, stepping away from a role she had inhabited for over a decade, walking into an uncertain future with no guarantee of the happiness or fulfillment she hoped to find. But as Alina stood there in the quiet library, watching snow fall softly over the garden she had loved and tended for so many years, she felt certain, more certain than she had felt about anything in a very long time, that this was the path she needed to take. The decision had been made, quietly and without fanfare, somewhere in the accumulation of small moments over these past weeks. Now she simply needed to wait for the right time to act upon it, gathering her courage and her resources until spring finally arrived, and the roads cleared enough to carry her toward the new life waiting for her at Thornfield Cottage. Spring came gently that year, the frost melting slowly from the fields surrounding Cranley Manor, the first green shoots appearing in the gardens Alina had tended for so many years. She watched these changes with a mixture of anticipation and quiet sorrow, knowing that each warming day brought her closer to the moment she had been preparing for throughout the long winter months. She had settled upon a date, chosen carefully to coincide with a period when Reginald would be away from the estate, attending to business matters in London that would keep him occupied for several days. This timing, she had decided, would allow her to depart without the difficulty of a direct confrontation, sparing them both the pain of a final scene that would likely accomplish little beyond causing additional distress. In the days leading up to her chosen departure, Alina moved through her final preparations with the same careful attention she brought to every aspect of managing Cranley Manor. She reviewed the household accounts one final time, ensuring everything was in perfect order for whoever would eventually take over her responsibilities. She wrote detailed letters to the housekeeper and head gardener, thanking them for their years of faithful service and providing guidance on matters they might need to address in her absence. She also wrote, with considerable difficulty, a letter to Reginald himself, though she did not intend for him to receive it immediately upon her departure. This letter, unlike the simple gesture of the keys left upon his desk, would provide the explanation she felt he deserved, even if she doubted he would fully understand or accept the reasons behind her decision. She wrote of the years they had shared together, acknowledging the genuine happiness she had once found in their marriage before it had slowly faded into the distant, dutiful arrangement it had become. She wrote of the dinner that had crystallized years of gradual neglect into a single, undeniable moment of clarity. She wrote of her hope that he might, in time, understand that her departure was not born from anger or spite, but from a genuine need to reclaim a sense of self that had been slowly disappearing within the confines of their marriage. She did not blame him entirely for what had occurred between them, recognizing that marriages required effort from both partners, and that she too had perhaps allowed herself to disappear too completely into her role, rather than asserting her own needs and desires more clearly throughout their years together. But she also did not excuse the pattern of neglect and dismissiveness that had characterized their more recent years, the way he had failed to see her pain even when she attempted to express it directly to him. She sealed this letter carefully and placed it in the drawer alongside the household keys, intending to leave both together on the morning of her departure, ensuring Reginald would find her explanation alongside the symbolic gesture of relinquishing her role within the household. The night before her planned departure, Alina found herself unable to sleep, her mind racing with a combination of anxiety and anticipation as she contemplated the significant change she was about to enact. She rose from her bed well before dawn and moved quietly through the darkened halls of Cranley Manor, walking through rooms she had known intimately for over a decade, pausing occasionally to touch familiar objects, to remember specific moments and conversations that had occurred within these walls. She walked through the dining room where the fateful dinner had taken place, the long table now empty and silent in the darkness. She walked through the drawing room where she had entertained countless guests over the years, hosting teas and small gatherings that had filled these spaces with laughter and conversation. She walked through the library where she had made her final decision, the same room where she had written her farewell letter to Reginald. Finally, she made her way to the garden, stepping outside into the cool early morning air, the first hints of dawn beginning to lighten the eastern sky. She walked slowly along the familiar paths, breathing in the scent of the roses beginning to bloom after the long winter, running her fingers gently over petals she had chosen and planted years earlier with such careful attention to color and fragrance. This garden, more than any other part of Cranley Manor, represented everything she had built during her years as Duchess. It had been her creation, her sanctuary, the one place where she felt she had truly expressed something genuine about herself rather than simply performing a role expected of her. Leaving it behind felt, in some ways, more difficult than leaving her marriage itself, though she understood that a garden, however beloved, could not offer her the genuine companionship and respect she needed from another human being. As the sky continued to lighten, Alina made her way back toward the house, understanding that the time for reflection had passed and the time for action had finally arrived. She had spent months preparing for this moment, carefully considering every aspect of her decision, and now she needed only to follow through on the plans she had so methodically established. She returned to her chambers and began the final preparations for her journey, dressing in traveling clothes she had specifically chosen for their practicality rather than their elegance, packing the last few personal items she wished to bring with her into a single trunk that had been prepared and hidden away weeks earlier. She moved efficiently, her earlier anxiety giving way to a sense of calm purpose as she completed each task. By the time full daylight had spread across the grounds of Cranley Manor, Alina stood ready in her chambers, her trunk packed and waiting, her traveling clothes properly arranged. She made her way one final time to her writing desk, opening the drawer to retrieve the household keys and the letter she had written to Reginald. She carried both items down the grand staircase, past the portraits of duchesses who had come before her, women whose stories she would never fully know but whose presence had offered her a strange sense of connection throughout her years in this house. She made her way to Reginald's study, the same room where she had confronted him weeks earlier about the dinner that had changed everything between them. She placed the household keys carefully upon his desk, arranging them neatly beside the letter she had written, ensuring both would be immediately visible when he returned from London and entered this room where he conducted his daily business. She stood for a moment, looking around the study, this space that had always felt more his than hers, understanding that this would likely be the final time she would stand within these walls. Then, without allowing herself to linger further or second-guess the decision she had spent months carefully considering, Alina turned and walked from the study, making her way toward the entrance hall where a carriage waited to carry her toward the train station, and from there, toward Thornfield Cottage and the new life she had chosen for herself. The household staff had gathered quietly in the entrance hall, having been informed of her departure only that morning, sworn to secrecy regarding the timing until she had safely begun her journey. Their faces reflected a mixture of sadness and quiet support as she moved among them, offering brief words of gratitude and farewell to those who had served Cranley Manor faithfully throughout her years as Duchess. Charlotte, her lady's maid, stepped forward with tears visible in her eyes, though she maintained her composure admirably. "Your Grace, we shall miss you greatly. I hope you find the happiness you deserve." Alina embraced the young woman warmly, grateful for the genuine affection that had developed between them over the years of service. "Thank you, Charlotte. I hope the same happiness finds you in whatever path your future holds." She moved through the remaining staff, offering similar words of gratitude and farewell, before finally making her way to the waiting carriage. She paused at the entrance, turning back one final time to look at Cranley Manor, this grand house that had been her home for over a decade, this place where she had experienced both genuine happiness and profound disappointment throughout the years of her marriage. She felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she took in the sight of the house one final time, but she did not allow herself to weep openly. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, drew a deep breath of the crisp spring air, and turned to enter the carriage that would carry her toward the beginning of an entirely new chapter of her life. As the carriage pulled away from Cranley Manor, moving down the long gravel drive she had traveled countless times over the years, Alina allowed herself finally to release the tears she had been holding back, weeping quietly for the loss of what her marriage might have been. For the years she had spent trying to make something work that had perhaps never truly been suited to genuine partnership from the very beginning. But even as she wept, she felt something else growing steadily within her chest, a quiet sense of anticipation and hope that she had not allowed herself to feel fully in many years. She was leaving behind a life that had slowly diminished her sense of self, and she was moving toward something uncertain but genuinely her own, a future she would build according to her own desires and values rather than the expectations placed upon her by title and social position. The journey to the train station passed quickly, the familiar countryside surrounding Cranley Manor giving way gradually to less familiar landscapes, as the carriage carried her further from everything she had known throughout her marriage. By the time she boarded the train that would carry her toward the region where Thornfield Cottage awaited her, Alina had composed herself sufficiently to face the journey ahead with steady resolve rather than continued tears. She settled into her seat by the window, watching the countryside pass by in a blur of green fields and small villages, allowing herself to imagine, for the first time with genuine hope rather than mere theoretical possibility, what her new life at Thornfield Cottage might actually become. She thought of the small but comfortable rooms she remembered from her single visit years earlier, the overgrown garden that awaited her attention and care, the quiet countryside setting far removed from the social pressures and expectations that had defined her existence as Duchess of Cranley. Meanwhile, back at Cranley Manor, the household continued its daily operations under the careful management Alina had established before her departure, the staff maintaining a respectful silence regarding her absence, awaiting the moment when Reginald would return from London and discover the truth of what had occurred in his household during his time away. That moment arrived 3 days later, as Reginald's carriage pulled up the familiar drive, the Duke returning from his business in London with no indication that anything significant had changed during his absence. He entered the house with his usual confident stride, calling for a servant to bring him refreshment as he made his way toward his study to review the correspondence that had accumulated during his time away. It was there, in the quiet solitude of his study, that Reginald discovered the household keys arranged neatly upon his desk, alongside a sealed letter bearing his name written in Alina's careful, familiar handwriting. He stood for a long moment, staring at these 2 items, a growing sense of confusion and unease beginning to settle over him as he tried to understand their significance. He picked up the letter first, breaking the seal with hands that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to tremble. As he read Alina's words, understanding began to dawn slowly across his features, followed by an expression of genuine shock, and though he might not have immediately recognized it as such, the first stirrings of regret for a pattern of behavior he had never truly examined or understood throughout the years of their marriage. He read the letter twice, then a third time, before finally lowering it to his desk and staring blankly at the wall before him, the household keys still resting untouched beside the letter that had just revealed the departure of his wife, a departure she had planned and executed with such careful precision that he had remained entirely unaware until this very moment. The full weight of what had occurred began to settle over him gradually, as he understood that Alina had not simply left him in a moment of impulsive anger following their difficult conversation weeks earlier, but had instead spent considerable time planning and preparing for this departure, ensuring every practical detail of the household transition was properly addressed before she allowed herself to leave. This realization, more than anything else, forced Reginald to confront the possibility that he had genuinely failed to understand the depth of his wife's unhappiness, that the concerns she had raised weeks earlier had not been mere sensitivity or exaggeration, as he had dismissively characterized them at the time, but had instead represented years of accumulated pain that he had consistently failed to recognize or address. For the first time in many years, Reginald Ashford, Duke of Cranley, found himself confronting the uncomfortable possibility that he might bear significant responsibility for the collapse of his own marriage, a possibility he had never seriously considered throughout the years He had grown increasingly distant from the woman who had once been his devoted and loving wife. News of the Duchess's sudden departure spread through the county with remarkable speed, carried first through whispered conversations among servants who traveled between great houses, then through the drawing rooms of the aristocracy who gathered for tea and gossip, and finally into the wider social circles of London itself, where the disappearance of a duchess from her husband's household provided endless material for speculation and scandal. Reginald found himself facing questions from every direction, curious inquiries disguised as concerned condolences, thinly veiled accusations wrapped in polite conversation. He struggled to formulate consistent explanations for Aline's absence, initially claiming she had traveled to visit family, then growing increasingly evasive as friends and acquaintances began to sense that something more significant had occurred than a simple family visit. Lord Pemberton, the elderly gentleman who had spoken with Aline during that fateful dinner months earlier, called upon Reginald directly, expressing genuine concern rather than mere curiosity. "Reginald, I have known your family for many years. I ask not out of idle gossip but out of genuine care for your well-being. Where is Aline, truly?" Reginald, unable to maintain his evasive explanations before someone he genuinely respected, finally admitted the truth. "She has left me, Lord Pemberton. I do not entirely understand why, though her letter suggests she felt neglected, unappreciated, unseen within our marriage." Lord Pemberton studied the younger man for a long moment before responding, his expression neither harshly critical nor entirely sympathetic. "I noticed something troubling at that dinner several months ago, Reginald. Your attention toward Lady Hartley, while your own wife sat largely ignored beside you. I wondered then whether you fully understood the message such behavior conveyed." Reginald felt a flush of shame rise in his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation for a man accustomed to confident self-assurance in nearly every aspect of his life. "I did not intend to convey any particular message. I was simply enjoying pleasant conversation." "Perhaps," Lord Pemberton said gently, "but intentions matter less than effects, particularly within a marriage. Aline has always struck me as a woman of considerable dignity and grace. If she felt compelled to leave rather than continue enduring whatever pattern of neglect led to this decision, I suspect the situation had grown far more serious than you perhaps realized." These words lingered with Reginald long after Lord Pemberton's departure, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths he had spent years avoiding through the comfortable habits of his daily routine. He began, for the first time in many years, to genuinely reflect upon his behavior throughout his marriage, recalling instances he had previously dismissed as inconsequential, but now recognized as part of a larger pattern of neglect and dismissiveness toward the woman who had devoted over a decade of her life to supporting him and managing his household. He recalled the many evenings he had chosen to dine with friends rather than spending time with Aline, the countless occasions when he had failed to seek her opinion on matters affecting their shared life, the way he had grown to view her presence as simply a fixture of his household rather than a genuine partner deserving of his attention and respect. He recalled, with particular discomfort, the dinner that had apparently served as the final catalyst for her decision, understanding now with painful clarity how his behavior that evening had likely felt to a woman who had already been enduring years of similar, if less overt, neglect. Meanwhile, at Thornfield Cottage, Aline was discovering the genuine pleasures of a life built entirely according to her own preferences and priorities. The cottage, though considerably smaller than Cranley Manor, possessed a charm that felt authentic in ways the grand estate never quite had. Its rooms filled with morning sunlight, its garden wild and overgrown in a manner that invited creative attention rather than demanding rigid formal maintenance. She spent her first weeks at Thornfield Cottage settling into a rhythm entirely different from her life as Duchess, waking when she chose rather than according to a schedule dictated by social obligations, spending her days as she wished rather than managing the endless details required to maintain a great household. She worked in the garden herself, her hands growing calloused in ways they never had during her years overseeing servants who performed such physical labor on her behalf. But she found genuine satisfaction in this direct, tangible connection to the land she now called her own. She resumed her painting with renewed enthusiasm, filling canvas after canvas with scenes from the countryside surrounding her cottage, the rolling hills and small streams, the wildflowers that grew abundantly throughout the meadows near her property. She read extensively, working through the collection of books her aunt had left behind, discovering new authors and ideas that expanded her understanding of the world beyond the narrow social circles she had inhabited throughout her marriage. Margaret visited frequently during these early months, always bringing news from London and the wider social circles that continued to speculate about Eleanor's dramatic departure, though Eleanor found herself caring less and less about such gossip with each passing week. "They speak of nothing else in certain circles," Margaret reported during one such visit, settling into a comfortable chair in Eleanor's small but cozy sitting room. "Some praise your courage, others criticize your abandonment of duty. I confess I find the entire spectacle rather amusing, given how little any of them truly understand about the situation." Eleanor smiled, pouring tea for her friend with hands that had grown accustomed to the simpler pleasures of domestic tasks she once would never have performed herself. "Let them speculate as they wish. I find I care far less about their opinions than I once believed I would." "And Reginald?" Margaret asked carefully, watching Eleanor's expression for any sign of continued distress regarding her former husband. "Have you heard from him directly?" Eleanor nodded, retrieving a letter from a small writing desk near the window, the first of several that Reginald had sent since her departure. "He has written several times, expressing regret for his behavior and requesting that I consider returning to Cranley Manor. His words seem genuine enough, though I confess I remain uncertain whether genuine regret translates into genuine change." "What will you tell him?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before responding, her gaze drifting toward the window where afternoon sunlight illuminated the wild garden beyond. "I have not yet decided how to respond, or whether to respond at all beyond a simple acknowledgement that I have received his letters. I find myself wanting to give this new life sufficient time to establish itself before I consider whether any reconciliation might be possible or advisable." This careful, measured approach characterized Eleanor's handling of Reginald's continued attempts at communication throughout the following months. She responded occasionally to his letters, acknowledging his words without committing to any particular course of action, maintaining a polite but firm distance that neither invited nor entirely foreclosed the possibility of future reconciliation. Reginald, for his part, found himself genuinely transformed by the experience of his wife's departure, though the process of this transformation proved slower and more difficult than he had initially anticipated. He began, for the first time in many years, to seriously examine his own behavior and priorities, seeking guidance from trusted friends like Lord Pemberton regarding how he might genuinely address the pattern of neglect that had characterized his marriage. He reduced his social engagements considerably, spending more time in quiet reflection at Cranley Manor, reviewing correspondence and estate matters that he had previously delegated entirely to others, beginning to understand more fully the extensive responsibilities Eleanor had shouldered throughout their marriage without ever receiving adequate acknowledgement or appreciation for her efforts. He also, with considerable difficulty, ended his frequent correspondence and social interactions with Camilla Hartley, recognizing that whatever innocent intentions he might have claimed regarding their relationship, continuing such interactions would only undermine any genuine effort toward reconciliation with Eleanor. Camilla, for her part, seemed genuinely surprised and somewhat offended by this sudden change in Reginald's behavior, though he found he cared considerably less about her opinion than he once might have. As months passed and autumn began to settle over the countryside once more, nearly a full year after the fateful dinner that had set these events into motion, Reginald finally requested a meeting with Eleanor directly. traveling to Thornfield Cottage himself rather than continuing to rely solely on written correspondence to convey his thoughts and intentions. Alina received his request with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, uncertain what such a meeting might reveal about the genuine extent of any changes he had made throughout the months of their separation. She agreed to the meeting, though she made clear through her response that she remained uncertain about any possibility of reconciliation, wishing simply to understand more fully what he hoped to communicate. Reginald arrived at Thornfield Cottage on a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves surrounding the property beginning to turn brilliant shades of orange and gold. Alina received him in her small but comfortable sitting room, offering tea with the same careful hospitality she had once extended to guests at Cranley Manor, though the setting itself, so much smaller and simpler than their former grand estate, seemed to underscore the significant changes that had occurred in both their lives since her departure. "You look well, Alina," Reginald said, studying her with an expression that seemed to hold genuine warmth rather than the distracted courtesy she had grown accustomed to during their final years together. "This life clearly suits you." "It does," Alina replied simply, settling into her chair across from him. "I have found genuine contentment here, Reginald, in ways I had not experienced for many years within our marriage." Reginald nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive, a marked change from their difficult conversation months earlier in his study. "I have spent considerable time reflecting on that fact, and on the reasons behind it. I confess it has not been comfortable reflection, but I believe it has been necessary." He proceeded to share with her, more openly and honestly than he had managed during any previous conversation throughout their marriage, the genuine self-examination he had undertaken during the months of her absence. He spoke of recognizing the pattern of neglect he had allowed to develop, of understanding more fully the weight of responsibilities she had carried largely without acknowledgement, of genuinely regretting the dismissiveness he had shown when she first attempted to express her hurt regarding his behavior at that fateful dinner. Alina listened carefully, watching his expression and demeanor for signs of genuine understanding rather than mere performance intended to secure her return. She found, to her surprise, that his words carried a weight of sincerity she had not expected, though she remained cautious about allowing this apparent transformation to immediately dissolve the boundaries she had carefully established since her departure. "I appreciate your honesty, Reginald," she said finally, when he had finished speaking, "and I believe you genuinely mean what you say, but I confess I remain uncertain whether understanding alone is sufficient to rebuild what was broken between us, or whether such understanding might fade once again into old patterns should I return to Cranley Manor." "I understand your hesitation," Reginald replied, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the conversation. "I do not ask you to return immediately, or to trust blindly in promises that words alone cannot fully substantiate. I ask only that you allow me the opportunity to demonstrate, through consistent action over time, that genuine change is possible." They spoke for several hours that afternoon, covering ground they had never fully explored during their years of marriage, discussing not just the specific grievances that had led to Alina's departure, but the deeper patterns and assumptions that had shaped their relationship from its earliest days. By the time Reginald finally departed as evening approached, no firm decision had been reached regarding reconciliation, but something had shifted between them, a genuine dialogue established where previously only distance and misunderstanding had existed. Over the following months, Reginald continued to visit Thornfield Cottage periodically, always respecting the boundaries Alina established, never pressuring her toward decisions she was not yet ready to make. Their conversations during these visits gradually deepened, moving beyond discussions of past grievances toward genuine exploration of what a renewed relationship, should they choose to pursue one, might actually look like. Alina found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, beginning to genuinely enjoy these visits, appreciating the more thoughtful, attentive version of Reginald that seemed to be emerging through his sustained efforts at self-reflection and change. Yet she remained careful not to allow this positive development to erase the important lessons She had learned about maintaining her own sense of identity and self-worth independent of her marital status. She continued building her independent life at Thornfield Cottage throughout this period, expanding her garden, developing genuine friendships within the local community that had nothing to do with her former title or social position, pursuing her painting with increasing skill and confidence. She had discovered, through the difficult process of her departure and subsequent independence, a version of herself that felt more authentic and complete than the dutiful Duchess she had spent over a decade performing for the benefit of others. As nearly 2 years passed since her initial departure from Cranley Manor, Alina found herself facing a decision that had once seemed impossible to imagine. Whether to allow Reginald back into her life, not as the distant, dismissive husband she had left behind, but as a genuinely transformed partner who had demonstrated, through sustained and consistent effort, real understanding of the mistakes that had nearly destroyed their marriage entirely. She did not make this decision quickly or lightly, drawing upon the same careful, methodical thinking that had guided her original departure. She spoke extensively with Margaret, who had witnessed the entire transformation of both Alina's independent life and Reginald's genuine efforts at change. She reflected deeply on what she truly wanted for her future, understanding that whatever choice she made, she would not allow herself to disappear again into a role that failed to honor her genuine needs and identity. Eventually, Alina reached a decision that honored both the growth she had experienced during her independence and the genuine transformation she had witnessed in Reginald over the preceding months. She agreed to a gradual reconciliation, though on terms significantly different from their original marriage, terms that ensured she would maintain her own sense of identity and independence even as they worked to rebuild genuine partnership between them. She would continue to maintain Thornfield Cottage as her own property, visiting Cranley Manor regularly but not immediately relocating there permanently, allowing both of them time to establish new patterns of genuine mutual respect and attention before fully merging their lives once again under the same roof. Reginald agreed readily to these terms, understanding that Alina's willingness to consider reconciliation at all represented a significant gift he did not wish to jeopardize through impatience or renewed neglect. Their relationship, as it slowly rebuilt over the following year, bore little resemblance to the distant, dutiful arrangement that had characterized their marriage before Alina's departure. Reginald made genuine efforts to include her in decisions affecting the estate, to seek her opinions and value her contributions beyond mere household management, to demonstrate through daily actions rather than mere words that he genuinely valued her presence and partnership in his life. Alina, for her part, brought to this renewed relationship a strength and confidence that had not fully existed during her earlier years as Duchess, a clear understanding of her own worth and boundaries that she would not allow to erode again regardless of the pressures and expectations that came with her position. She had learned, through the difficult experience of leaving and rebuilding her life independently, that genuine partnership required both parties to maintain their individual identity and self-respect, rather than one partner disappearing entirely into service of the other. Nearly 3 years after that fateful dinner when Reginald had lavished attention upon Lady Camilla Hartley while ignoring his own wife, Alina stood once again in the gardens of Cranley Manor, though now she divided her time between this grand estate and her beloved Thornfield Cottage. Maintaining both properties as symbols of the different aspects of herself, she had learned to honor and integrate. The gardens had flourished under the continued care she provided, even during her years of partial absence. The roses she had planted years earlier now mature and abundant, filling the air with their familiar, beloved fragrance. She walked slowly along the paths, remembering the young woman who had once walked these same paths in despair and uncertainty, contemplating a departure that had seemed both terrifying and necessary. That young woman had found, through her courage in choosing herself over the comfortable but diminishing role society had prepared for her, a path toward genuine happiness and authentic partnership that she could never have imagined possible during those difficult early months of her separation. She had learned that love, genuine love, required mutual respect and attention, that a marriage built on one partner's constant sacrifice and the other's casual neglect could never provide true fulfillment, regardless of the title or social position it might offer. As she stood there among her beloved roses, watching the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the familiar garden paths, Alina felt genuine gratitude for the journey that had brought her to this moment, this hard-won understanding of her own worth and the kind of partnership she deserved and had ultimately found. She thought of the household keys she had once left upon Reginald's desk, that simple but powerful gesture that had set into motion everything that followed. She no longer needed to prove her worth through constant service and sacrifice. She no longer needed to accept diminishment and neglect as the price of maintaining her marriage and social position. She had discovered, through the difficult but ultimately transformative experience of walking away, that genuine strength sometimes required the courage to leave before genuine healing and reconciliation could become possible. The Duchess of Cranley who returned to this grand estate was not the same woman who had once departed in quiet despair. She was stronger, more certain of her own value, more capable of maintaining genuine partnership rather than mere dutiful service. And in this transformation, both she and Reginald had discovered something far more valuable than the comfortable but hollow marriage they had once maintained. A genuine, evolving relationship built on mutual respect, honest communication, and the hard-won understanding that love, to truly endure, must honor the complete humanity of both partners equally. As twilight began to settle over Cranley Manor once more, Alina made her way back toward the house, where Reginald waited for her with the genuine warmth and attention that had become the new foundation of their relationship. She smiled as she walked, thinking not of the pain that had brought her to this point, but of the strength and wisdom she had gained through choosing herself, and ultimately finding her way toward a partnership genuinely worthy of the courage it had taken to leave and the grace it had taken to eventually return. The story of that fateful dinner, once the subject of endless society gossip and speculation, had gradually faded into simply another chapter in the long history of Cranley Manor, remembered now not as a tale of scandal and abandonment, but as the beginning of a transformation that had ultimately led both Alina and Reginald toward a marriage built on foundations far stronger and more genuine than anything they had known before. And Alina, walking through her beloved gardens toward the home she had chosen to return to on her own terms, understood at last that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is simply walk away, trusting that whatever waits on the other side of that difficult choice will be worth the courage it took to make it.